Index Space Marines is out, and there's really quite a lot of cool new units with big abilities. Seems to have got Hellblasters shooting on death, a Contemptor that resurrects itself, and I think that Games Workshop really wanted to sell some Storm Speeders. Let's take a look at a few of the more exciting and powerful unit abilities from the new Space Marine rules. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more. The full index rules for Codex Space Marines have dropped from Games Workshop, and while I'm hard at work at the slides and the review for that in full, I thought it would be fun to just stop off and talk about a few fun units, things that have really quite powerful individual datasheet abilities, and might potentially gain a new lease of life as a result. I think it is going to make army construction rather interesting in 10th edition. Really quite a lot of datasheets just have really quite powerful unit rules that might draw you to taking the unit, even in absence of particularly outstanding stats. At least a few of these I think might be enough to get them the nod, even if they aren't on paper quite as efficient as some other choices within the codex, just for raw damage and defense. Going through one by one, and first up Incursors have indeed lost Infiltrate. They're not going to be starting in the mid-board, but they do still get a scout move, means they could have a little bit of mid-board threat presence, moving up 6 inches before the game begins, hopefully on their way towards a midfield objective or something. Their carbines do a little bit of damage, 2 shots at 24 inches, and have the ignores cover and assault keyword. I think the assault one is particularly handy, as it means that you can always be moving d6 extra inches, provided you don't want to charge. To compensate them for the loss of their infiltrate ability though, it looks like the Incursors do have a rather interesting unit special rule. I guess they're putting those little optical scanners on their backpacks into some very good use now. The way that their unique rule works is their multi-spectrum array allows them to target one unit that they've hit with those Oculus Bolt carbines of theirs. They don't have to inflict wounds or cause any damage or anything, just need to have hit them, and then for the rest of the phase, every time a friendly Adeptus Astartes unit targets that same unit, you get to add +1 to the hit roll in the shooting phase, so often going to be moving from hitting on a 3+ to hitting on a 2. I think this is pretty crazily powerful to be honest, just for a cheapish unit of Space Marines with bolt guns that can have their own utility for being on objectives and things. Never mind their actual damage outputs, just ping a couple of bolt shots into a unit that you really want dead, then all your big heavy guns for the rest of the army can all be hitting on a 2+ against that unit rather than their normal 3. Seems to be just another way that Space Marines can focus a fairly obscene amount of damage on one pinpoint target, and they do have a few other ways as we'll discuss in this video. Just straight off though, you could stack this with Oath of Moment for almost guaranteed hits on a unit if Oath just wasn't really quite enough to bring the unit down. A 2+ rerolling all hits is probably overkill and you could just spread the buffs out different ways, but if you did really want one unit dead, then that makes Oath of Moment onto an extra level. Perhaps like quite a lot of things with these unit abilities in 10th, I feel like there's a lot of value just to taking one unit of them, maybe above and beyond taking multiple. Next up we've got the Hover Fortress of Doom that is the Repulsor. This one's toughness 12 and 16 wounds now, still with a 3+ save, so is at least fairly hard to take out unless you've got dedicated anti-tank. Perhaps going to be a little bit trickier to remove from the board than it was in 9th edition. A lot of its guns have a fairly similar feel, but I do quite like the way that its weapons are being consolidated into a Repulsor defensive array. 18 shots at 24 inches, all with strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. I must admit I think that's a really quite nice touch. I feel like whenever you find a Repulsor you'd have to go through allocating around about 9 different shots, and then I think usual procedure was to get halfway through the allocation and then forget which ones you've allocated where by the time you've got to the end of them. Quite nice to have a lot of the small arms just consolidated into a whole bunch of strength 4 attacks. It can transport 12 models now and can take Firstborn as well as Terminators and Centurions, so that's kind of interesting to give it a whole load of interesting units to put in it. And particularly with the new transport rules, it could be zooming around and then getting units out after them, so should genuinely add to their speed. The cool thing about the Repulsor though, which was teased earlier, is that if you have a unit that's by the Repulsor, they can potentially get back into it in the enemy turn if the enemy decides to declare a charge on them. Every model in your unit has to be within 3 inches of the Repulsor. I guess that would be easy enough though if they just got out of it after the Repulsor had moved last turn. That should basically happen automatically. I guess it means that you could zoom up with a whole unit of Hellblasters or something in it, or a bunch of Eradicators. The enemy moves up and tries to charge them, then they just jump straight back behind all that adamantium, and now if the opponent either can't reach the Repulsor or doesn't have the right sort of damage profiles to deal with it, basically you're not going to be able to deal with the Repulsor's pet unit in combat. Looks like that could be kind of problematic for some melee armies maybe, though kind of means that if your Repulsor is transporting around a unit, you might be forced to deal with the Repulsor first before you really take effect against the targets within it, though obviously it's not going to matter anywhere near as much against shooting armies. Next up we've got Scout Snipers. These are now distinct datasheets from the regular Scouts. They gained a 2 wound profile, so are really quite a lot harder to kill rather than the 1 wounds that they were before, they did tend to go down very easily against small arms that wasn't quite as effective against your regular Space Marines in power armor. The snipers lost their mortal wound damage output, but they're now strength 4, AP 2 and damage 2, and they also hit on a 2+ when they're static with the heavy keyword. Definitely a lot more of a competition for eliminators now. Not that eliminators are bad or anything, they've got strength 5, damage 3. The interesting thing about the scout snipers though is they basically get a special rule from their camo cloaks, I guess, that gives them kind of lone operative style targeting restrictions. They get the stealth rule innately, so they're always -1 to hit, but above and beyond that you just can't shoot them full stop if you're greater than 12 inches away from them. I guess that could just be quite helpful, just making them hard to deal with while they do what they do. Maybe sit in a high ruin and get the extra AP against ground targets. That does seem perfectly reasonable, and your opponent just flat out can't shoot them with most of their big heavy guns. But it also seems quite good as well for camping on either home objective or corner deployment ones. If your opponent actually can't catch up with them and get really quite close to them, they just can't do anything about them, so I guess that point is yours. I must admit the amount of things that can't be targeted outside of 12 inches in 10th edition is quite a lot, it would seem. Having a massive amount of guns in the gun line just perhaps isn't quite as reliable as it might have been before. Next up we've got the Invictor Tactical Warsuit. This one's become a scouts unit at 8 inches, so it doesn't actually set up in the midfield anymore right on the opponent's deployment line, as scary as that might have been. It's toughness 8 now, so it's a little bit less fragile to small arms, though it has lost a wound, and broadly speaking its damage profile maybe isn't too different to how it was before. The autocannon's got twin linked. I think the interesting thing about the Invictor though is that it's basically got a rule for protecting nearby Phobos units when enemies try to shoot at them. Its combat support rule means that if there's some friendly Adeptus Astartes Phobos units within 6 inches of them, and the enemy takes a shot at them, the Invictor can immediately get all defensive about them, and after the enemy unit has shot, it can immediately shoot them straight back, lighting them up with some frag storms, stubbers, autocannons, and that heavy bolter. It does have quite a lot of attacks. Seems pretty powerful that it just gets to do that completely for free once per turn, lighting up and doing some extra damage on the enemy. Unlike Overwatch, it doesn't have to hit on 6s or any other restrictions like that. Could really make opponents think twice about firing on nearby Phobos units next to the Invictor, I suppose, and could be a little bit problematic if they don't have the anti-tank guns in place to deal with the Invictor first. It also seems like it isn't the only unit with a similar sort of counterfire type mechanic on there. Looks like both the Invader ATV and attack bikes also have a similar rule for mounted units that they're nearby. I guess it might be a little bit more restrictive if you've equipped them with melter weapons, as the multi-melters are only 18-inch range now, but still I think it's a fun little mechanic, quite a nice idea of a big gun walker or gun bike protecting the nearby brethren. Next up we've got 4+ invul saves in your units for 1 character buff. Librarians have definitely become a lot more restrictive now they can't choose their psychic powers, but at least they do get some meaningful buffs out of them. We'd already seen that the Terminator Librarian gets sustained hits 1 for the Terminator attacks, a nice damage boost there that's kind of akin to old Captain sort of powers, but it seems now that the Librarians on foot, both the Primaris one and the Firstborn one, have the raw Mental Fortress to just casually give a 4+ invulnerable save to the unit that they're leading, both at range and in melee. They also have their smart attack and an okay melee stat line, plus some defense against mortal wounds as well. Mainly going to be a defensive upgrade there for the most part. For choices of units he can lead, you can either choose an Assault Intercessor Squad, Desolation Squad, Hellblaster Squad, Inferno Squad, Intercessor Squad, or Stern Guard Squad, basically the Tacticus range of units. I feel like out of those ones, maybe Hellblasters or Stern Guard are perhaps the best targets, high value shooting units that you really don't want your opponent just removing straight from the board. I feel like often the troops units might be running smaller squads just to take objectives and things. Looks pretty solid for both of those as well. A 4+ invul's pretty excellent on a 3+ save unit, and the feel no pain against psychic attacks is rather nice as well. The Firstborn aren't excluded with their foot troops getting it as well. And interestingly enough, the Phobos Librarian kind of does similar to the Scout Sniper rule. He grants stealth to the Phobos unit that he's leading, and also means that they can't be shot from greater than 12 inches away as well. Again, potentially interesting if you do really want a Phobos unit to survive long-range firepower. Might be a bit questionable to have that kind of buff going onto a Phobos unit that don't generally tend to be the most massive damage dealers in their own right. I still think unless he's cheap it probably won't be used all that much, but could definitely make them really quite annoying, and that would feel very guerrilla warfare, with a bunch of slightly lighter troops that you just can't get to grips with. Next up we've got the new Contemptor Dreadnought datasheet, which honestly I wasn't sure whether they were even good to have in this index. They did say that the Forge World Horus Heresy one was going to Legends, but it does seem like the old plastic one with the Assault Cannon and Multi-Melter still lives. It was in the previous Codex Space Marines, so I guess there was always still a chance, but just maybe seems a bit curious if this one still exists, but the much nicer kit with the Forge World one is now going to Legends. I suppose he's not entirely out of the woods in the Space Marine Codex. There might well be a chance that he doesn't get an updated datasheet there if we're unlucky. Stat line wise, he's fairly tanky. Toughness 9, a 2+ save and 10 wounds now, though it does come at the expense of -1 damage for all Dreadnoughts but the Redemptor. The thing that I found really quite fun on his profile though is that basically even in death he still serves. He's got a chance to remain alive the first time that he's killed, or a 2+ at the end of the phase when he's killed the first time. Unless you roll that dreaded 1, then he just stands back up again at the end of that phase with d6 wounds remaining. Definitely not a small deal to have another turn of this guy shooting and acting, potentially right in the middle of your opponent's army where you can get to grips with some choice targets. I'd be kind of surprised if he's got a particularly amazing damage and defense just in terms of raw efficiency for the points, but this rule really does seem quite disruptive, particularly without a degrading profile or anything. Unless your opponent can shoot him dead and then charge him again in the fight phase, he can just stand back up again and then go blasting around with the multi-melter or assault cannon and follow it up with another round of Dreadnought melee. Next up, I've got a suspicion that Games Workshop wanted to sell some Storm Speeders. These things have been kind of lackluster fragile damage dealers for quite a bit of 9th edition. They only really got particularly useful towards the end of it, and in general mainly for Dark Angels armies where they got 3 5+ invuls. Now they're toughness 9 and 11 wounds with a 3+ save, tougher than a Rhino there, so they're not anywhere near as hard to kill. Still fast and still pack a fair punch of firepower. The Hailstrike does anti-infantry, the Thunderstrike and Hammerstrike more anti-tank / anti-fly. The Hailstrike was the one that I thought that its unique rule was perhaps one of the most interesting things. Its weapons will be good against light infantry, but they are all AP 0, so it's only sort of limited effects there. But the special rule of the Hailstrike is absolutely awesome. Basically when he shoots a target, something that he shot gets a big debuff, everything else in your army shooting at it will be a bonus +1 to your AP against it. It means that AP 0 weapons go to AP -1, AP -1 to AP 2, and so on and so forth. I think this really is a fairly spectacular buff in the era of 9th edition with much lower AP. High saves are going to be a challenge to overcome, and again this strikes me as perhaps an even better buff that you could layer on Oath of Moment, as it kind of works with it rather than against it. Reroll all hits and wound rolls plus extra AP on every attack. You're definitely going to kill that one target thoroughly dead, unless you do want to spread this out to something different. It does seem pretty great with indirect fire as well. Extra AP would cancel out the benefit of cover. Otherwise though, the different Landspeeder variants all get some very powerful unique rules in addition to their raw stats. The Thunderstrike hands out a +1 to wound against monsters or vehicles that it targets, a massively powerful buff that one. It's just going to be a bit underwhelming if you don't have monsters and vehicles on the board. If you targeted an Imperial Knight with one of these though and gave the rest of your army a +1 to wound against it, that would be bad times for that knight. The Hammerstrike has some interesting guns and hands out ignores cover to the unit that it targets. Not a terrible debuff, but I'd say worse than the first two. And then the standard Landspeeder has a rather interesting +1 to hit and ignores cover for any blast weapons that you're firing. Kind of depends on how many of those you have in your army, but that's certainly a very solid buff. Again, it works particularly well with ignores line of sight barrage type weapons, things like whirlwinds, which are actually fairly dangerous now at strength 8 and AP 2 damage 2. Overall, I feel like the Landspeeders are going to have a massive selling point for their special rules, focusing some Space Marine firepower on choice targets. Next up, and sticking with speeders, we also have the Landspeeder Tornado. This one I don't realistically think is quite as powerful as the others, but I think it's just kind of fun. Lots of flyers in 40k often get bombing run type attacks, move across a unit and have a chance to deal mortal wounds, and now it seems that the Landspeeder Tornado also gets one of those rules. This one's actually representing it doing a bit of a strafing run, I guess with that assault cannon. Feels very biplane in a cornfield type thing. You roll 6d6 against one unit that you've moved over, each 4+ deals a mortal wound, and you're not allowed to use it against monsters and vehicles. I guess it's infantry and mounted units mainly. Realistically, I feel like getting the Landspeeder Tornado too close might not always be the greatest idea. It's going to get killed by anti-tank or medium damage weapons really quite easily. You might be better hovering back at a safe distance and dealing some damage. If the enemy does get too close though, and it makes sense to play aggressive with these, they can certainly turn on the damage with a bunch of mortals in addition to their regular attacks. If you do want to play a bit cagier with a Landspeeder though, then the Typhoon looks kind of interesting. That one gets a move shoot move d6 inches type rule, so I guess that's quite nice for hanging around the backfield and remaining hidden. Finally, just perhaps particularly interesting as a much improved unit is the Gladiator Lancer. This thing was kind of hampered with pretty underwhelming stats in 9th edition I thought, so much so that Games Workshop just repeatedly kept on dropping its points cost time and again until it got really quite cheap and maybe a little bit more worth taking. I think with its new stat line though, it is looking rather nice. The Laser Destroyer is a very big hit. If you can stay still, then it's heavy to hit on a 2+, and you get 2 attacks at strength 14, AP -4, and damage d6 +3. 2 shots still isn't a lot of attacks, even with a really big anti-tank weapon like that, and it can bounce off invul saves, but it seems that the Gladiator Lancer just takes things to the next level in terms of reliability, as it has a rule called Aquilon Optics. This one allows you to reroll a single hit roll, a single wound roll, and a single damage roll every time it fires. You're going to be hitting on a 2+ or 3+ most of the time, very high chance to have 2 hits convert, and then you're going to be wounding on a 3+ basically all the time, unless you're trying to take down Titan equivalents and things. With average rolling, even if the Lancer moves and doesn't get the heavy keyword off, you average around about 1 or 2 failed saves on average against a Rhino with a 3+ save, and then re-rolling the big d6 damage result that you can get. That adds yet more average damage. You average around about 10 wounds on something like a Rhino, obviously in chunks of d6 +3. It's a very, very scary anti-tank punch, though obviously things like invul saves will definitely cut it down quite a lot. A 5+ invul will average you down to 1 failed save, and it's going to be a very tempting target for your opponent to command point reroll, that sort of thing, as it would save them a lot of damage if passed. Still though, it looks far, far more usable. At least it seems genuinely good at its dedicated purpose now, rather than kind of lackluster at it compared with the Valiant. Let me know what you make of these guys, and what are your other favourite unit abilities from Index Space Marines. Let me know down in the comments below, and I'll hopefully be back for a video fairly shortly, breaking down every single datasheet for Codex Space Marines and their Gladiator Strike Force launch detachment. Hopefully I'll see you in that one. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, and if you'd like to help support the channel, then I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page as well, and that's linked down in the video description if you're interested in helping out. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.